Welcome back to Question Period. While President-elect Donald Trump's win this week is significant, so too is Vice President Kamala Harris's loss. It's the latest in a global wave of anti-incumbent sentiment, to say the least. In the UK, in South Korea, South Africa, incumbents were defeated in elections this year. Over in France, Japan, and India, opposition parties made significant gains. Here at home, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau insists he is staying on as leader, despite trailing Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives by double digits for about a year. On top of that, recent polling from the Angus Reid Institute shows 38% of respondents think Pierre Poilievre would be better suited to dealing with Trump, compared to just 23% who believe Trudeau would be the best option. Now, 25% of people surveyed said they don't think either man is up to the task of dealing with a second Trump presidency. So what lessons are there for Canadian political leaders following these election results? Our Sunday strategy session is perfectly placed to answer that question. Corey Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Kathleen Monk is former Director of Communications to the late Jack Layton. And Scott Reid is former Communications Director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody.
Hey,
nice to have both of you in studio. We'll start with Scott because we're missing him in studio. Scott, as you watch these, and we were together on election night, as you watch these results unfold, we've had a few days to process them. If you're sitting in the Prime Minister's office, what is the takeaway politically at a strategic level out of this?
Well, what the takeaway should be is don't overlook the obvious. And, you know, we all indulged last week, maybe not all of us, certainly I indulged. I was a dummy who indulged in overlooking the obvious and trying to find, in a spate of overanalysis, some reason to ignore the fact that voters in the United States want to change. 70% of voters in the U.S. said they thought their country was headed in the wrong direction. That is why Kamala Harris lost. And so if I'm sitting in the Prime Minister's office and I know that only 25% of Canadians think the country's headed in the right direction, I have to realize that that is the wall, the unforgiving wall that I'm running at as fast as I can. I think it's a devastating loss for folks in the Prime Minister's office as they look across the border, because what it reminds you is that voters who want change will not be denied. And I think that's a very, very, very tough verdict for Justin Trudeau.
How do you tactically, if you are the Liberals, Corey, respond to that?
Well, there are obvious things that they're not doing, like change your leadership and change some of the unpopular policies that are driving the decline in your numbers, especially things related to affordability. And the most obvious one that we talk about all the time is the carbon tax. They're set to increase it again in the spring before going into the next election, or what could be the next election. So I don't think that a status quo and then just hectoring people saying, oh, well, you should think about the world differently than you do and wag your finger, it works very well anywhere, but I think we got another example of that not working well in the United States. You know, if Kamala Harris had an answer as to what she would do differently than Biden, instead of saying, I can't think of a single policy I would change, she might have fared better, you know, for all the reasons that Scott said it. Change election, change electorate. People want a government that's more focused on the economy. And if you're talking about democracy, I'll tell you something, you're living a pretty comfortable life, because most people who were voting for Trump were worried about paying their rent or their mortgage or their job or their purchasing power when they go to the grocery store. Those are the things that the electorate wanted to talk about, not the, you know, some abstract state of democracy sort of play, which just did not resonate with the electorate and what its focus was.
I think, like, just jumping off that, Kathleen, in the days that followed, I was trying to think to myself as well, like, what explains this? And I could tell you very specifically the threat that the Democrats and Kamala Harris specifically thought Donald Trump posed. I don't think I could tell you 4 to 5 things that she was going to do to improve the economic situation of people. I know they existed, but I didn't hear that message as frequently as I did, you know, a characterization of Donald Trump that they believed in. Is there a lesson in that for the Liberals?
There's so many lessons. Out of the U.S., I would say, first of all, the Liberals have to approach, all parties have to approach this loss and what happened in the States, or the outcome, I should say, and approach it with humility. Number one, I think one of the lessons I take away from it, that character attacks don't work for someone who's been in the public eye, the public sphere for 3 decades and has run for president 3 times. But there's a couple other lessons. You know, Corey mentioned it. You you have a pretty big luxury of time and space and mind if you could be thinking about democracy and multilateral institutions, which is something that this government talks a lot about. When people really were reflecting on the past 4 years in the U.S. and saying, my life isn't that much better than it was. And that's why they wanted to vote Biden/Harris out. But the thing is, you spoke about incumbency off the top. People in this election year of 2024 have also spoken about immigration, obviously inflation, all major factors. But there's a fourth letter I that has been impacting these elections across democratic countries across the globe this year, and that's inequality. And that's the issue that needs to be addressed. That the 10-point spread in gender with men voting enormously according to exit polls for Trump is that they feel that they haven't been given a fair shake, that there's an economic inequality that they are wrestling with. And there's a lack of a dignity of work, frankly, that they have been given. And I think that Trump, ironically, for all of his riches and the fact that he has been given a silver spoon from birth, he spoke to that in a way that, frankly, Democrats didn't. And they need to get back to a class narrative and get back to addressing the issues of inequality.
This is more the strategy part of it. What about from a more pragmatic perspective, Scott? Is that the Liberals will often tell you now, look, this isn't necessarily a bad thing for us because we handled it well the first time around. And to be fair to them, it was in the positive column for them in their first mandate. I would argue this time, or the context right now is much different. They're trailing the Conservatives for a year. They are at the end of 9 to 10 years of government, which means the people who are in there are not exactly the same people who were there at the start of their first mandate. Is this good or bad news for the Trudeau government from a more pragmatic perspective?
I think it's bad news for whoever happens to be in government in Canada right now. And the Trudeau government deserves enormous credit for the way they handle the USMCA renegotiations. And I actually don't think it's about, who's there and who isn't there. I think they have a playbook. I think that all makes rational sense. The challenge is that Trump has changed. His circumstances have changed. He won the popular vote. He's got control of both houses of Congress. He is emboldened. And I think that Trump will look back on USMCA and say, well, the mistake was that I gave them anything at all. When it comes to trade talks, the traditional thesis is we need to work on mutual interests. We need to seek win-win. That's not how Trump views the world. And he has the freedom to view it now in any way he sees it. He sees the world as a zero-sum game. If I give Canada something, then I get less. If America is to win, Canada must lose. That's the problem as we sit across the table from him. And having friends in, border states or a Republican governor here or there, I have a feeling that those people are going to be afraid to walk in his office, tell him something he doesn't want to hear. No one is going to stand in his way, and we're going to have a hell of a time engaging in a way that, causes him to believe that it's in his interest to do anything other than take what he wants and, demolish what he doesn't.
We've been talking a lot about the federal Liberals. Corey, is this bad or good news for the Conservatives federally?
I think it's good news for the Conservatives. I think you're seeing yet another electorate that's largely in alignment around the things that we talked about around the economy. Things like class that you were talking about. I think the other element that we haven't touched on is that the Republicans have established a working class coalition that is irrespective of race and ethnicity and background compared to what you saw in 2016 and in 2020. I think you're seeing some of the similar winds blowing north of the border as well. I kind of disagree with Scott in terms of positioning. I think this round of USMCA, NAFTA renegotiations are an opportunity to actually pull ourselves closer to the United States and perhaps target some of the trade practices that Mexico's been engaged in, which are a lot different. Mexico is a very different economy compared to the US and Canada. Ours are much more alike. And Mexico's is much more different. It's much more like the situation that the U.S. is experiencing with China. So I think there are some
trade of a 10% tariff first.
Well, we'll see whether that actually comes in, Scott. But what I do know is the U.S. government and the Canadian government has spent tens and tens of billions of dollars in investing in things like EV manufacturing and batteries and chip production and all of these things, only to see Chinese product trying to make its way into the North American market tariff-free via Mexico. And that is a trade practice that is not in the interest of Canada, which is why you've seen parties across the spectrum here in Canada calling on the Canadian government to impose tariffs, and why you've seen those tariffs in place in the United States. I would add to that there are things like critical minerals that the United States desperately needs. There's a global fight for these things. Canada has lots of them. China has bought up the market almost everywhere else in the world. So there are a lot of reasons, I think, to pull Canada and the U.S. closer together. But I don't think it's going to be good news for Mexico, frankly.
Last word to you, Kathleen.
I guess one thing I would worry about is campaigners have a saying, you can't fight the next campaign based on the old campaign playbook. So the caution I would give to the Liberals right now is they're going to have to think outside of the box on actually how to approach Trump this time around. We know one thing for sure, though, that Trump always brings turbulence. And that actually could result in a lot of earned media, potentially, for any political leader who tries to actually, meet Trump where he's at. So that obviously presents opportunities for the governing party, the Liberals, but it also presents opportunities for Jagmeet Singh, who can, unlike the Liberals, distance himself and actually attack Trump, speak to the wide swath of Canadians who actually, don't like Trump, that progressive thing, and actually wrap himself in the Canadian flag and try to fight for those jobs.
Just really quickly, though, does it matter, though, that if he's trying to be prime minister, that doesn't feel very prime ministerial if you're going to be up against Trump as prime minister?
But fighting for your country is never wrong. Putting country before party is never wrong. And I think that you can do that in fighting for Canadian jobs in a way that's respectful. I agree with you there. But it's actually fighting for what we need to do for this country to have further growth, to have further economic gain, for better education opportunities for folks, for people to be able to get a good job and, frankly, be able to buy a house.
Okay, on that note, I will leave it. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the discussion. Corey Tenike, Kathleen Monk, and Scott Reed.